And so they got there early and made sure that they set up the site just right. They had a ring of stones for their fire pit, and they found a nice log that they could set up that they could both sit on. They made sure to stake down their tent really carefully. And after a final cup of tea, they both decided to go to bed. In the middle of the night, Sherlock woke up, kind of nudged Watson. Watson, he said, "Look up in the sky. Tell me what you see." Watson said, "I see thousands of stars." Sherlock goes, "Right, Watson. And what does that tell you?" And he says, "Well, meteorologically, I don't see any clouds. So I know that it's not going to rain anytime soon." And he said, "I see that there's a certain bluish kind of color, which tells me that scientifically that the universe is still expanding. And because the stars are moving, it means that the universe is constantly in motion." He said, "And theologically, it's obvious that there's a great creator God that loves us, that put all these things in motion." After a short pause, Sherlock Holmes looked at Watson and said, "You fool, no, someone has stolen our tent." I thought that was fun. We're continuing our journey this morning in the book of Mark. We're at the point where Jesus has been, as people have come to him and he's been approached about fasting. Why are your disciples not fasting? He's been asked this question by John's disciples. And we learned last week that fasting is kind of a natural human body response to experiencing extreme emotions like grief and guilt and shame. There are just moments in our lives where we can't eat, right? You've heard the phrase sometimes, "How can you eat at a time like this," right? It's because there's this natural body, physiological response for us to fast at moments like that. The Bible and God commands us in Leviticus during the Day of Atonement. He tells the Jews, he actually sets apart a day in which they are to fast. And on that day, it makes sense because it is a day in which they spend time in solemn reflection. And it is a time when they are recognizing their weaknesses, their shortcomings, and how they have not lived up to this promise that they have between them and God. And so it seems natural and right and logical that they would not eat during a time like that. The emotions probably would not allow them to. And in this moment that these men are coming to Jesus and asking about his disciples, these followers of John, they probably have good reason to be fasting as well. We know that just a little bit beforehand that their religious leader, their religious teacher and master, John the Baptist, had been taken into custody. He's been arrested and he is now in jail. That would probably cause them to enter into a period of fasting and prayer and beseeching God on John's behalf. And whether the Pharisees are just listening or some of their disciples also approached Jesus with this question, they may have been fasting for the wrong reasons. They may be fasting simply to get others' attention. But Jesus, after that, hearing this question, he changes their perspective and gives them, refocuses their attention on something else that is going on. So that's where we are in Mark chapter 2, verse 18 through 20. It says, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came and said to him, "Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "While the bridegroom is with them, the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast, can they? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. We brought up last week that in Jesus' response, there is no condemnation of fasting. He doesn't say, because that's not what you're supposed to do. He doesn't say, because that's not what God told you to do. He doesn't judge them for fasting, which gives me the impression that for those men, it may have been right, like John's disciples, like we spoke about, because their teacher is in jail. It may be right for them in that moment to be fasting. That might be what they are going through. And in that, it reminds me that my experience is not always another's experience. What I am going through is not always what another person is going through. And so I need to be careful about my expectations about what their behavior and their response is. What he does do is he gives these inquisitors, these people that are asking this question, a refocusing of what his disciples are experiencing. And he begins with the image, a metaphor of a wedding. He tells them that when the groom is with them, how can they fast? And so we have the first instance in the Gospel of Mark of an image that Jesus will use over and over and over again, one of our relationship with him as being a bride to a groom, one of a wedding feast, of a marriage. And so to truly understand what Christ's point is as we continue to go through the Gospel of Mark and encounter these images, we have to have a little bit of an idea of what a first century Jewish wedding may have been like. The truth is that we don't know a lot. There isn't a lot of archaeological evidence that tells us what a wedding ceremony looked like back then. We just don't know. If I was to tell you or to mention that somebody was getting married, probably the first images that come to you is two people standing up here with an officiant, right, a pastor or another member of a clergy or the court system and people exchanging vows. There are rings involved, right? There's some I do's that are said, probably a poem. If it's a Baptist wedding, it might be a 2-hour sermon. Just kidding. If there's usually meditation, right? Some sort of challenge, encouragement to the two that are joining in matrimony. We have an idea of what that ceremony looks like. We don't have a really good idea of what those ceremonies looked like back then. In fact, it may have been as simple at some point in history, it may have been as simple as the dad leading the bride to the groom's tent, and then after a period of some special time, they were considered married. It may have been that easy, that simple of a ceremony. But what we do have a little glimpse of is the celebration that occurs around the marriage. We do know that in some cases that the celebration took place for almost an entire week. In some cases, even 2 weeks of feasting and music and dancing and celebrating this new union. We also have an idea that during this time, before the actual ceremony, before the actual celebration, that the groom would go back to his father's house. And there he would set up a place for his new bride and him to live. And then after he was done, their celebration would start. He would get all his buddies together, and his family would all get together. And there would be this beginning of this celebration, the food and the music, the laughter, the fellowship, everything that goes along with a wedding celebration that we experience now. And at some point, this groom will decide that it is the right time for him to leave, go to his bride's house with his friends, with much fanfare. It would be like a parade. It would be one of those moments that some of you might look outside your house and go, why won't they just be quiet? Because there's a wedding going on. The whole town would know. And the groom would invite his bride, and they would escort her back to her new home. And there the celebration would continue for days. We get a glimpse of this in the book of Matthew, chapter 25. It's the parable of the 10 virgins. It's one that you're probably familiar with, where there are the bride's, let's say, maids of honor, matrons of honor, that are hanging out with her. And they're all looking for the groom. There's no scheduled time as to when he is going to come and receive the bride to him. So they must constantly be waiting and watching and ready. And in this parable, Jesus tells about how these certain friends of the bride, they didn't bring enough oil for their lamps. They weren't prepared. And so the bridegroom comes at a time when they're off trying to buy more oil, and they miss out on the party. But in verse 10, it gives us a glimpse of what these times were like. It says, and while they were going away to make the purchase, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding feast, and the door was shut. It gives us an idea that that's the kind of what I explained is what is going on here. This incredible celebration. But it's also important, I think, because what Jesus is trying to give these people asking this question about fasting an idea of is the perspective of the bride. What is her experience in this? And we might be able to get a glimpse of it from another part of the Bible. In the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon is an incredible book of just love poetry, of love stories, of about a man wooing a woman, of a woman expressing her affections for a man. And in chapter 2, we hear a lot about a bride's perspective of her groom. This may be young love. This may be kind of a love at first sight kind of experience. But this is really what is going on in the heart and mind of this bride at this time as she's thinking of her soon-to-be husband. I want you to just hear these words and think about how this relates to the church as we think of Jesus coming to receive us and bring us to his home. It says, I am the rose of Sharon, the lily of the valleys. Like a lily among the thorns, so is my darling among the maidens. Like an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the young men. In his shade I took great delight and sat down. And his fruit was sweet to my taste. He has brought me to his banquet hall, and his banner over me is love. Sustain me with raisin cakes, refresh me with apples, because I am lovesick. Let his left hand be under my head, and his right hand embrace me. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the field, that you do not arouse or awaken my love until she pleases. Listen, my beloved, behold, he is coming, climbing on the mountains, leaping on the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag. Behold, he is standing behind our wall. He is looking through the windows. He is peering through the lattice. My beloved responded and said to me, Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. For behold, the winter is past. The rain is over and gone. The flowers have already appeared in the land. The time has arrived for pruning the vines, and the voice of the turtle dove has been heard in our land. The fig tree has ripened its figs, and the vines and blossom have given forth their fragrance. Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. O my dove, in the clefts of the rock, in the sweet secret place of the steep pathway, let me see your form. Let me hear your voice, for your voice is sweet, and your form is lovely. Catch the foxes for us, the little foxes that are running in the vineyards, while our vineyards are in blossom. My beloved is mine, and I am his pastures, his flock among the lilies, until the cool of the day when the shadows flee away. Turn, my beloved, and be like a gazelle, or a young stag on the mountains of Bethlehem. Without getting into the steamier sections of that, if we can start to get through some of the imagery, you know, there are points when you're in love where food just kind of tastes better, right? You can be eating at McDonald's, but if it's your beloved that is on the other side of the table, it might as well be Five Guys, right? It kicks it up a notch, right? There's everything just, the colors are more striking when she's around or when he's around. You know? And let me just see you one more time. Let me just hear your voice. I'll throw away all of my CDs of Adele. You just sing for me. That's that experience that the bride is having. This all-consuming, immense love for the groom. This anticipation of his arriving, of coming, that she might spend the rest of her life in this kind of experience. And it is the groom that is the source of this joy. See, Jesus makes that point in his response. He says, when the groom is with them, how can they be fasting? How can they be feeling grief? How can they be feeling shame or guilt? When all these emotions that we just heard from the Song of Solomon, how can one not eat at a time like this? I mean, throw your diet aside for a few days. It's okay. Have another bowl of ice cream. This is the time to celebrate, because the groom is here. One of the first miracles that Jesus performs is at a wedding. He turns water into wine. And I think it's interesting, the response of there's like a wedding planner there that seems to be overseeing everything. And when he tastes the wine and realizes how good it is, his response is interesting. The first person he goes to is the groom. It's found in John chapter 2, verse 9. When the head waiter tasted the water which had become wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called the bridegroom and said to him, Every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. Who's in charge of keeping the party going? Whose responsibility is it to have the banquet feast prepared? Who's in charge of making sure that there's enough wine to go around? It's the bridegroom. It's Jesus. He is the source of our joy. He is the source of our celebration. And so though in this moment John's disciples may be experiencing grief, anxiety, Jesus is putting a bit of a hedge of protection around his disciples, and he's saying, no, you may be experiencing loss, but we're experiencing a wedding. And how can these men do anything but celebrate while I am here? They have no choice. Their bodies won't allow them to fast. It won't allow them to grieve, because the bridegroom has finally come and has brought them to the wedding feast. You see, these questioners are coming to Jesus and going, how can you fast when your cousin is in jail? Remember, the Gospel of Mark, first verse. Mark's whole point is to get across to us that this is not John's cousin. This is the Son of God. And so Jesus, in his response, refocuses. You are seeing me now as John's cousin. But in all reality, the person that you have before you, and even though my disciples can't verbalize and vocalize it right now, they know it, that the one that stands before you is the Son of God, the great bridegroom that the Father has promised all along. So, what should our response be? There are moments and there are seasons. Jesus in the last verse reminds us that those seasons, even for these disciples, the seasons of grief, the seasons of fasting will return. He says there will be a time when the bridegroom is ripped from them, as he prophesies his own demise at the cross. So we know that there are seasons. There are seasons of grief. There are seasons of sadness, and some of them run deep. And yet there are seasons of joy, and there are seasons of celebration. And Jesus doesn't condemn either one. And so when we relate and meet and experience life together as a body, we must be aware that our seasons are not everybody's seasons. That it is okay to fast when you are going through a season that requires fasting. And it isn't okay to just shout with joy when you are experiencing a season of joy. Both are ordained and created by God. But the source of that joy, let the source of that joy in your lives be from the Creator of joy. From the one whose responsibility it is to keep the celebration going. The bridegroom himself, the Son of God, Jesus the Messiah. Amen. If you would, please stand. We have one more song to sing together, and like last week, we'll be singing it again a cappella.